I was contacted and asked if we would consider having an HIP coordinator for our district. And as soon as I saw it, it's like, what is a HIP and what is a coordinator and how would it work in the district? So I gave John, our speaker today, I gave John Curry a call and I said, can you tell me, enlighten me a little bit about who is HIP and what will they be able to do to help support our clubs? After having a great conversation and a better understanding of what HIP is, I knew this was going to be a natural fit for our district and more specifically our clubs. As our clubs try to figure out how they can engage more members of different areas in their communities, HIP gives us that opportunity to do it. And I'm pleased today to have John Curry, who's the president of the Pickering Rotary Club, but as well as he's the executive director of HIP. And he will also be introducing our new district coordinator for HIP, who is a member of the Thornbury Clarksburg Club. So John, welcome to our district and take it away.
Thank you very much, District Governor David. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak with everyone. HIP has been around since 2014, and I always like to start with this slide. Even though I know I'm speaking to Rotarians, I think it's always a great place for us to begin the conversation because we promote peace, we fight disease, clean water, local economies, education, mothers and children, and now we've also are adding environmental to our mix as well. The important thing on this slide is that there's 720 clubs in Canada, and I know your district crosses over to the States, and I'll talk a little bit about how HIP has expanded internationally and what that means as we go forward as well. But for purposes of us getting started with HIP, we recognize that we had 720 clubs across Canada. What was also interesting as we were looking at doing this wonderful stuff all around the world was that we would hear news about our Indigenous people here in Canada and the struggles that they had faced or are facing. And we thought, well, we're doing this wonderful stuff all around the world. How come we're not doing something here at home? And remember that number 720? Well, we found out that there's 633 First Nations across Canada. And it almost seemed like an ideal match to match 720 Rotary clubs with the 633 First Nations. What we also recognize is the wonderful stuff that our Indigenous people have done, the wonderful contributions they have given to our country here in Canada and around the world. When you look at it, we had over 1/3 of the First Nation population actually go and participate in wars. That's just not just 1/3 of men, that's 1/3 of the whole entire population, which is like a huge sacrifice on behalf of any group of people. We also recognize the different languages, the different cultures, and the other contributions when Europeans arrived here, how they helped us to be able to survive this harsh climate. So it's really important that we take a look at this and understand that we have 1.6 million First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada, and it's actually one of the fastest growing populations and one of the fastest growing workforces that are out there. Our Indigenous people have been through all sorts of tragedy. And when we talk about what they've been through, we're not talking thousands of years. We're talking as late as 1996 was when the last residential school closed. You'll see a picture here in 1830 of Thomas. Thomas is wearing his Indigenous outfit, and then in another photo, he's wearing European-style clothing. This photo was taken the same day. This is a propaganda photo to say, hey, we are wiping the Indian out of the child. If you've ever visited one of these residential schools, you'll certainly understand that they weren't there for a simulation. It was really to destroy the culture, to really wipe the Indigenous culture completely off of out of our country, for sure. You'll see a picture here of in 1876 of an Indian agent. An Indian agent controlled every aspect of Indigenous people's lives, whether they could leave the reservation, whether they could start a business, whether they could hire a lawyer. The last Indian agent didn't leave until the 60s from the reservations. And so up to that point, there was no education of adults of Indigenous people. The youth were taken away from the communities. And you wouldn't, I mean, I have a hard time sometimes imagining entire communities without any children at all. And the impact that that has when you have that happen generation after generation. And I'll share a little story with you. I grew up in Dryden, Ontario. It's between Thunder Bay and Winnipeg. It's a very, very small town. And the entire time I grew up, I didn't know that there was actually a residential school that was in within 50 kilometers of my house, of where I grew up. This residential school was tucked away in the woods. It was actually on the far end of a lake. There were no roads into it. And when they brought the youth, the Indigenous youth, to this place, they would have to boat them in. There's no doubt in my mind that if you're trying to assimilate people, you wouldn't tuck them away in the woods. You would bring them to the very communities you're trying to assimilate them to, so that they can adjust, so that they can learn. But when you hide way back in the woods, no good can really come from it. There were many youth that went to that residential school that were never seen again. There are no burial sites. There's nothing. I was speaking to an Indigenous elder, someone who's my age. And when he was very young, he was about 4 years old. He was with his mom and dad at their home, at their camp on the lake, and a plane flew down. Two men got out of the plane as him and his brother were playing on the shore, and they picked up his brother and put his brother in the plane without ever speaking to his parents. His parents were only a short distance away from the shore, but they couldn't see where the kids were playing. And his brother, this elder, was speechless. He couldn't even scream. He was so scared. And he witnessed his brother getting into the plane and being flown away. The parents and this elder never saw that young man again. And that young man was actually taken to McIntosh Residential School, the very school I was speaking about. And back in the woods, nobody knows where he's buried. Nobody knows what ended up, how he ended up. And this went on for hundreds of years, where you're taking youth away, and you get this multi-generation trauma that's actually occurring today. And we're seeing the healing from all of those aspects. And again, the last residential school closed in 1996, within our lifetime here. Now, I'm not going to dwell on all the past and all the negative stuff that have happened. There's a lot of positive things that are happening today. But what's really important is to recognize that Indigenous people are still going through healing. They still have, aspects of that trauma that impact their life today. In 2014, we recognized here as Rotarians that we need to do something about it, but we weren't sure what we were going to do. And before doing anything, we actually began to do our research and our homework. We reached out to Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers, and we said, listen, if HIP were to get involved, what would it look like? And time again, it kept coming back about education. And I'll talk about this in a moment, because it's not just education of Indigenous people, but it was an education of non-Indigenous people, because many don't know the truth. Many don't know what actually has happened, because we've either heard propaganda or we've read news stories, and it's always been about, the poor Indigenous people, whereas they haven't had an opportunity to really showcase and share and have a voice on their own beliefs, their own culture, and their own engineering and aspects that is so rich and beautiful. One of the greatest things we did as we were forming HIP, we made it a true partnership between Rotary and Indigenous people. So our board is actually 50% Indigenous and 50% Rotarian. And it is quite possible one day that it could be 100% Rotarian, because we are seeing trends where, as we're working together, Indigenous people are actually joining Rotary overall. We have 50% women, 50% men, and we're geographically dispersed from coast to coast. Here's a picture of our board, and these are all leaders in their own communities. Some of them you may even know from your Rotary travels, and they do stretch from coast to coast. And in fact, currently we're interviewing another board member who is from Inuit, the Inuit communities. And so we'll actually be able to cover coast to coast to coast within Canada. Within each district, we've been able to recruit district coordinators. And while we were on this journey, our focus was primarily Canada and reconciliation. Uh, but our model quickly got identified by other countries who also experienced colonialism, and they wanted to know what we were doing and how it was going. So we started to share our knowledge, share our processes, share some of the projects and things that we've been working on with other Rotarians around the world. And as you know, you plant a seed with Rotary, and in no time at all, the concept starts to be adopted by like-minded people. So we now have a coordinator down in Australia who's following a similar model. We have contacts within Hawaii, Arizona, Mexico, South Africa, Fiji, New Zealand, all starting to begin to work together. And it's not about dictating how to do something, but it's showing the model that we use and allowing each region or each district to begin to work with Indigenous people, because that's truly what our model is really about. It's not about a specific project. It's really about how you can come together within a community, and each community will be very unique in itself. Now, it's very interesting that our vision and mission was formed before COVID. You know, as we look at our vision today, it means even more today than ever before. When we talk about Indigenous and non-Indigenous and all people being interconnected and interdependent. If anything has really taught us that, COVID has. Our mission really is about social change and about building more strength within communities themselves and helping the next generation, which I'll talk about something very specific that we just launched last week in regards to youth. It was Ian Risley who said in 2018 at the conference here in Toronto that we work together because that is how we achieve. We leverage our contributions to do more together than we could ever do alone. And if there's any organization out there that does that extremely well, it's Rotary. And I would also argue that our Indigenous people have that equal number of connections worldwide. And as partners, if we partner together, there's some amazing things that we can do. So what does this all mean, and how do we go about doing it? Well, we've learned that it's not about doing things for Indigenous people. We've learned that it's doing things with Indigenous people. There's so much knowledge and wisdom that Indigenous people bring, and they have the ability to solve their problems. Sometimes they just need some additional support from resources that Rotary has. And in that way, we can make wonderful partners. So the first step has always been about awareness and learning and educating ourselves about Indigenous people, and especially wherever you can do that locally. The second step is about the building of the relationship. You know, to reach out and invite Indigenous people to our events, to participate in their events, and to really truly get to know Indigenous people. We've seen communities that have never spoken to each other beginning to now work together because they held an event together. There was a Rotary Club that has access to a camp for people that are disabled. And the Indigenous chief, as they were having the very first conversation between the Rotary president and the Indigenous chief, said, hey, could we hold an event there? Because we have a lot of elders that can't get out on the water because they have diabetes and they're stuck in a wheelchair. Well, this camp had boats and pathways that were wheelchair accessible. And the Indigenous people brought the feast, and the Rotary had the park and helped facilitate the event. And together they had a wonderful, wonderful experience, one that led to them working on projects together and the actual community joining Rotary at the end of the day as well. So before jumping in and doing anything, which is sometimes hard for us Rotarians because it's in our DNA to actually, we hear something and we want to jump in and we want to make an impact right away and do something. The biggest impact we can make is just by building those relationships and making those friendships so that we can talk about how we might work together. And that is the next step, how we can work together. Locally, there's lots of projects that we can work together that we share a common interest in. In some cases, it might be water. In some cases, it might be homelessness. In most cases, it's something to do with community and the next generation. And we're finding that those projects then become a further way of solidifying the relationship and enjoyment as the community well-being begins to occur. I want to talk about a project we just launched last week, and it's an evolution of a number of different things. We adopted the RILA model. We included our experience with youth-to-youth engagements. For example, there's a picture here. I took 9 Toronto students to Moose Factory. The students here exchanged robotics knowledge for land-based education, and they continue that relationship today. Even despite COVID, they have been connected over video conference, and as they plan to go to university, both groups of youth are planning to attend similar universities because they've got friends who have similar interests. So we evolved the idea and the concept more around land-based and environmental education, and we're to the point that we're bringing 25 Indigenous and 25 non-Indigenous youth together over a course of a few days to learn land-based and environmental education. And the first of this series will actually occur in Ontario, in just above the Peterborough area. And we're very, very excited about it because it does a number of things for us. I mean, it's got the peace building and relationship element to it. It's got the cultural awareness element to it. And it's got the environmental land-based element. And obviously youth as a focus is in the next generation, and how we can help them have a great future means a lot to us as Rotarians. So there's lots of little steps, and I always leave this slide behind on how to begin the journey. And I know that anywhere you live in the world where there's Indigenous community that's close by, the first step is just to reach out and to begin to have that dialogue, begin to have some conversations. We are not an advocacy group. We're not about government negotiations or anything of that nature. We are simply about peace and about healing of communities and bringing people together so that you can work on the bettering for the future generations overall. Now, I'm going to pass it over to one of our district coordinators, and I know our District Governor David Elliott has already mentioned Clay. Clay is very special for a number of different reasons. Clay actually works for the Indigenous Sports and Wellness of Ontario, and he's got many years of experience working in partnership with Indigenous people. And I'm very happy to introduce Clay. And at the very end, Clay and I can then help answer any questions that you might have. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Clay.
Great. Thank you, John. I really appreciate it. And John, I'm really excited to be one of your newest members of the HIP team. So I'd like to just start on a personal level, if I could. And the picture there is Machu Picchu in Peru. And that was one of my lifelong goals, just to climb that mountain with a friend. So it was a 3-day trek, and we were successful, although my breathing has never been the same since. But I love to travel. I been fortunate enough to be involved with the Canadian Sport for Life, helping with physical literacy, both for Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and love to paddle, canoe, kayak. Really enjoy it. Next slide, John, please. The scope of the portfolio for that we want to work on here contains really 3 parts: awareness, education are the first 2. And if I could just talk briefly, the awareness of the Indigenous the peoples, and John did a great job in covering the history. But what I've learned in my 7 years is that the young people are now a generation away from making huge impact in this world. They now have stepping stones through schools, through college, universities, all through Ontario, and I hope through the world, to be able to get their degrees. They're now coming out with lawyers and engineers, so they can be self-reliant. So these young people are going to make a difference, and they're strong, and they really are able to walk in both worlds. From an education standpoint, what we want to do is to look at the Indigenous groups across the district, and to see how we could support them, how we might be able to integrate them and celebrate their culture and their activities. And lastly is, as John mentioned, there's a youth-to-youth program that HIP has, and also the organization that I work, we have a Standing Bear Leadership Program. So between those two youth programs, we're hoping to kind of bring that to communities across the district. So back in my community and the Rotary Club that I belong to, Thornbury Clarksburg, several months ago, we had a great discussion, and the board of directors decided that they would have a new Indigenous director position. And that position would focus in on awareness, education, and relationship building. So again, I would offer that any communities across the district that have an Indigenous, either a need for education or Indigenous people, there's lots of ideas that we can share and look at some integration of programs and projects. Next slide, John, please. The last thing I wanted to mention is the formal relationship, and this is how I met John Curry. Well, I guess it was about 3 years ago. And John and I started to look at the HIP program, what they wanted to do. I was able to share with him what we were trying to do at ISWO. And our common ground was around working together around youth leadership. We felt that if we worked with young people, young Indigenous people, we could strengthen them and then broaden them out to be able to integrate with non-Indigenous youth. And then together, they will be better. So there were lots of other elements to our memo of understanding that we built, but that's how we got together. And again, we'll search for other organizations that we can work together with. Last slide, please, John. Lastly is, so this is just a little bit more about the organization that I work with. And so we're just in Ontario, and we service the 350,000 Indigenous people across the province. But what I wanted to leave you with is that what we try to bring them is wellness and sport. So, we try to help them in their development of their culture and sport development, and to try to grow the young people. Because if we have strong young people, then the future is bright. And what John always says is that if we can bring the Indigenous people together with the non-Indigenous people, it's endless what we can do.